So good evening, and thank you for putting up with what's likely to be an incredibly flawed, yet hopefully interesting to some extent, commentary on The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. This is the first time that I've actually seen this. The reason I'm doing this commentary is because I was challenged to watch this film by a friend of mine as part of a long-term debate that we've been having over Facebook. Now, I understand that Lee Strobel is a journalist, and that this is written essentially as his story of how he converted to Christianity from being an atheist. Obviously, we'll comment on that more as it comes along, and as I don't fully know his background story, and I want to find out more about it. I'm looking forward to watching this, and obviously I'm looking forward to seeing what people think about this commentary, and I'm looking forward to seeing if this provokes further debate from my friend, and also from anyone else interested in watching it. Just in terms of a bit of background about me, I used to be a Christian. I converted to Christianity from, well, generic non-belief at the age of 13, and was a Christian up until about a year ago. I'm now 33, and when I say I was a Christian, I was a genuine, born-again, Bible-believing Christian who believed that Jesus Christ had died for my sins, and that his death was a sacrifice that would allow me to have eternal life if I only believed in it. Now, I've come to the conclusion, after much soul-searching and prayer and reading in particular, that this belief that I had is not a reasonable belief based on the evidence that we have available to us. I've now got to a point where I feel that I needed to tell people exactly why that was, and as a result I wrote this blog, which is leavingchristianityblog.wordpress. Now, I'm just going to pause the film for a minute because I think it's important to have a little bit of housekeeping before we start. First of all, I don't intend to talk over the entire film. I'm interested in watching the film. I haven't got preconceived ideas about exactly what's in the film, although I will be very honest and say that I don't think this film's likely to present evidence to me that is going to make me reconsider my decision about Christianity. That's not to say that there's no evidence that it could show that would make me do that, but for reasons that will become clear, I strongly suspect, based on the lines of argument that I'm expecting to be presented here, I'm going to try to show that the common evidences which are given towards the believability of Christianity really don't hold up to inspection, particularly in light of how we treat other beliefs that are in the world today and other supernatural things which are claimed to go on around us all the time that we basically don't give a second thought about. It may well be that I'm prejudging this. I don't want to prejudge this, but it's impossible to come at it from a completely unbiased view. So I think it's important to be honest about it. In the same way, I'd expect that Lee Strobel is honest about the fact that he came to this film with the desire to convert people to Christianity. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly reasonable thing for him to do. But at the end of the day, this film is a piece of propaganda to try to encourage people to become Christians, in the same way that plenty of atheist material on the internet is propaganda to try to get people to become atheists. We just need to be honest about what we're dealing with. Now, I think the first thing that I need to do is I need to lay my case out. I'm not going to take ages over doing this, but I suspect it is probably going to take me around about 10 minutes to do so. Now, the reason for this is not because I'm trying to get the first word in or anything. I am really interested in watching the rest of the film, okay, and I want to comment on it. But I do appreciate that if I don't do this, I'm likely to need to interrupt the film almost constantly to put my case forwards, whereas what I like to do is put my case forwards, then have the film challenge me in whatever ways it can, and then me come back at the film as needed through the film. It may be that the film raises points that I've never thought of, which is going to be a really serious thing where I really need to look into that, or it may be that the film simply tries to counter some of these points here, and then obviously it's up to you as the listener to decide who's correct. So, I mean, just to start with, I think it's really important to make it clear to anyone who's listening to this that I am not trying to criticise their faith. I don't think that Christianity is stupid. I was a Christian for 20 years, okay? I understand when people hold faith, and when I left the faith, I'm absolutely humbled by the response of people that I knew in the church and how they treated me when they could have treated me really quite badly. They treated me very, very kindly. However, and I really, with the greatest respect, need to say that, in my opinion, there are some very serious issues at the heart of Christianity, and that these issues render it wholly unbelievable. But it's also issues at the heart of its philosophy which are very dark, and potentially psychologically dangerous, and I think it would be very disingenuous of me to remain silent on that. Okay? So, if you are watching this as a Christian, trying to get some additional reinforcement about why it is that you should believe in your faith, I challenge you to think genuinely in terms of examining your faith. Because if your faith is indeed true, and that what I'm going to say here is wrong, then surely doing this can only strengthen and improve your faith. I used to try to do this all the time when I was a Christian, and I used to always feel that I'd won, and that I was right as a Christian, and that I'd answered the argument in the favour of Christianity. But it was only when I really started looking at the gospel documents themselves that I started to appreciate that I could be wrong. And I tell you what, it's a very, very strange feeling when something that you've held dear for that long just begins to unravel in front of you like a bundle of threads. It's also really, really liberating as well. Okay? So, as I've mentioned, I wasn't born a Christian. I became one about the age of 13. Okay? And now I'm going to lay down here why it is that I'm no longer a Christian. So, just to play out two things first of all, based on what this film may well try to present. Generally speaking, there seem to be two ways that Christianity can try to defend itself from criticism, and I think that's probably true for any religion. So it will either try to show that it's true, which is obviously the most sensible way for it to move forwards, but sometimes when people are debating, they do try to show that it's useful, and that we should believe it because it's useful. Now, I'm not really going to spend much time here discussing whether Christianity is useful, and that's because, you know, rationally, even if Christianity is useful, if it's not true, it's not worth believing in. And I think most people listening to this would agree that if you're going to spend your life willfully putting faith in a lie, that's a fairly terrible sacrifice to make. But I think very briefly I should state that I don't think that Christianity is useful. See, at its heart, Christianity, as I've stated already, makes you believe you're evil, and there's nothing you can do to make you better. You deserve to either burn forever or be obliterated, whichever your view of hell is. The Bible doesn't actually say a huge amount about hell. However, an all-wonderful God who loves us can save us if we dedicate our lives to him. I used to believe that. Now, if you look at this from outside Christianity, and I do appreciate that people listening to this who are not outside Christianity may have a hard time seeing what I'm saying here, but please do spend some time thinking about this, because I do believe this holds up to examination. That is a really quite unpleasant belief, okay? Just imagine for a minute that you're in a relationship, and over time your partner belittles you to the point where you've got no self-esteem left. Then they start to hurt you physically, but you accept it because you feel you deserve it. And then they say that you have to do what they say or they'll hurt you. But if you do what they'll say, then you'll be okay. And they say that they love you. And if you love them, then they won't hurt you anymore. Now, this happens a lot. I'm a GP. For anyone in America, that's basically a family doctor. And this is called domestic abuse. And sadly, I see victims of it regularly in that. I'm also do some psychiatry work, and I see it in that as well. I do not think there is a huge difference between that sort of domestic abuse that we see in human relationships and what we're offered here by God. This is a very, very medieval way of looking at the world. Essentially, you're offered two choices: eternal damnation, or give up your life to a supposedly loving deity. How can we love someone in that way if they're basically saying, love us or we'll do this to you? But anyway, move aside, because that is not the argument that drove me away from Christianity, okay? So the only thing that's really important is whether it's true, because at the end of the day, even if the God of the Bible is abusive, narcissistic, and megalomaniac, if the Bible's true, none of that matters, because we better believe in him or else. So, let's look at whether Christianity can be true or not. Now, we've picked a relatively easy religion to do this with, okay, because of the fact it's very book-based. So it works on the basis that God inspires writings, and these writings tell us what we need to know about God. So we don't need to get into philosophical arguments about whether we can prove there's no God, okay? It's irrelevant to whether Christianity is true, because all we need to do is look at the Bible, essentially the gospel accounts of Jesus, and see whether they're trustworthy. Christian faith comes from the Bible, and as a result, it lives and dies by it. So if the Bible is false, then there cannot be any Christianity. Now, I used to think that these gospel accounts were very reasonable historical sources. For instance, and I don't know if the video is going to put some line like this in, but people would often say things to me like, there's more evidence for the existence of Jesus than for Julius Caesar. But when you look at it in depth, that really isn't true. Although I do think that Jesus probably did exist, in the same way that I think that Robin Hood probably did exist. That doesn't mean that all the stories about Robin Hood are true. So let's look at the earliest gospel, Mark. So this gospel, written about 40 years after Jesus' death, I suspect the video we're going to watch isn't going to contradict that. That's generally speaking what most scholars would think. So who was Mark? Well, who were any of the gospel writers? Ultimately, we we don't really know. The Gospels were written anonymously. The early church gave them names, but they arose around about 200 AD. The first reference to them is in a book called Against Heresies by Irenaeus. Now, the reason that this matters is we do need to try to establish whether or not these documents are eyewitness accounts, because obviously an eyewitness account would be much more important and trustworthy. So ultimately, what we need to be asking ourselves is, could these be eyewitness accounts? Could the disciples or friends of the disciples have written the Gospels as is claimed? Now, I'm going to argue here that it's highly unlikely. So first of all, Jesus' companions were illiterate peasants. So even if they did learn to write, which they may well have done, it's quite a big leap to see them being able to write Gospels in rhetorical Greek styles, particularly as they spoke Aramaic. So it's much more likely that the Gospels were named long after Jesus' death, and the people who wrote them never tried to really get people to even think they were the disciples. They were written anonymously, these Gospels, at the end of the day, by later Greek Christian converts who combined the stories about Jesus that they believed to be true into Gospel accounts. So I don't think it's likely that these people were trying to somehow pull the wool over our eyes in some way. I think they genuinely believed what they were writing down. But I don't think they were eyewitnesses. I think they got the stories from other people. So then, okay, let's say that that's the case. How did they get these stories? Well, they were mainly stories that were spoken. At the end of the day, these were stories that will have been brought down mainly by oral transmission until the earliest writings down. And the earliest writing downs that we've got that tell the story of Jesus' life are the Gospels. So what would oral transmission have been like back in around about that time? And how accurate was it? Because we often have this belief that oral transmission in those days was way, way better than it is now. We all know that if you tell a story to someone and they tell it to someone else, that it's going to get properly messed up over several retellings. We actually call that Chinese whispers, don't we? But we seem to have this belief that back then people were really good at this stuff. Well, actually, we can study this and we can see how good groups that rely on oral transmission actually are at keeping their stories the same. For instance, there's been studies done on African and Balkan tribes who still tell stories in a saga format. And over a year or two, these can change up to 50%, yet they'll still be considered by the listeners to be the same story as the original one. And that's because it's the gist of the story that matters more than the words. Now, this is a really, really big issue for Christianity in a way it might not be for a Balkan saga, because there's so much importance in the faith is placed on the words of Christ. And the other concern, of course, with oral transmission is exaggeration. So particularly when you've got an extraordinary story, such as the ones in the Gospel, it's very likely with retelling that people are going to embellish it because they're excited about it. It's human nature to do that. And we can see that happening in stories that we tell people about events that have happened in our lives or in people's lives around us. This would be even more the case if you truly believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and that by telling people about him, you might save them. You want them to believe you. And so as a result, it's very difficult not to exaggerate the story to some extent. You're probably not meaning to do any harm by doing that, but the problem is it gets amplified over time. So it's quite likely that the Gospel stories, by the time they actually got to the people who wrote them down, may well have had very little in common with what actually happened at the time. So, if that was the case, then we've really got very little basis for Christianity. But I want to move on, so let's just assume that I'm wrong. Okay, because otherwise we can't really move forwards, okay, because we've got documents that mean nothing. So let's assume I'm wrong, and somehow what we've got written in the Gospels is something which is an eyewitness account, okay, or maybe even that the Gospel writers themselves did, the disciples themselves learnt Greek and learnt highly advanced rhetorical methods, and they wrote the Gospels themselves. So, what happened next? Okay, so you've got these written documents, that are varying between 40 to 80 years after Jesus had died, okay, that have been written down by people that we don't think that, as I've stated before, I think there's very good evidence to show they're not eyewitness accounts, but let's pretend they are. So what would have happened? Well, they'd have been copied by hand. There was no printing press. Pretty laborious process, lots of error, both accidental and intentional. At the extreme end of the intentional, there are whole books in the Bible that are complete forgeries. Lots of Paul's letters are considered to very likely be forgeries. Ephesians, Colossians, Hebrews, 2 Thessalonians, the pastoral epistles, for instance. These were ones that would have been written by someone else pretending to be the more famous Christian, in this case Paul, in order to lend their own slant on Christianity more believability. Now, I'm not trying to say here that the Gospels are forged, okay? I'm not aware of any evidence they are, although, as I've mentioned, the names attached to them are probably wrong. But there is quite a lot of evidence, in fact overwhelming evidence, that errors crept in. So for instance, take our earliest existing copy of Mark. That comes from around 200 AD, so it's about 150 years after it's written. That's 150 years of copying of copies, probably copying Chinese whispers of Chinese whispers, of course. So did errors creep in? Well, yes. You see, actually we can show that there are more errors, more differences between the versions of the New Testament documents than there are words in the New Testament. Sorry, just pausing for some beer. If these are the inspired words of God, then which words were inspired? Is it the Bible that we have in our hand now? Well, if so, then early Christians who had different readings, and in some cases whole different books, they lived in heresy, they're in hell. All of these, early Christians. Or is it the Christians today who are wrong? Maybe, somehow, we've lost the original message, and everything that we're doing in a church now is basically just damning us. We've lost the original faith. It can't be both. Which is it? The only honest thing we can say here is that we've got no idea of the exact words of Christ, and we have a very minimal idea of what his teaching really was. Now, please don't take my word for this, okay? Read about it. There's lots of information out there. There's a scholar called Bart Ehrman. There's other scholars like that as well, but Bart Ehrman's very, very good at putting it in terms which are very simple to understand, who lays this all out in a way that you can look at it for yourself very easily. You can even look at the original documents yourself if you want to. But you can still do some of this yourself right now on the internet or with a Bible if you've got one. Just look at the Gospels side by side. There are loads of inconsistencies, and they can be quite serious. For instance, involving who Jesus thought he was, whether people are saved by good deeds or by belief, regarding the crucifixion, regarding who was present at the resurrection, what was found at the resurrection, or even if anyone even told anyone about the resurrection. So, for instance, let's start by looking at the crucifixion. So in Mark, Jesus goes to the cross silently, he's nailed to the cross silently, he's marked, he remains silent, he then shouts out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then he dies. Now, try to imagine that you're reading that without knowing what the Gospel's meant to say, because you know what the other Gospels say because you're reading them now. Just imagine that you don't. You've just read Mark. Well, what are you meant to believe as a Christian about Jesus' death? It looks like it's a bewildered man, unsure of why his mission from God has ended so unpleasantly. And also in Mark's Gospel, it strongly appears that the writer of Mark believed that Jesus became God at the moment of his baptism. There's nothing to suggest that there was anything unusual about Jesus' birth, that he was born of a virgin, and there's nothing to suggest that he pre-existed the earth. When you get to John's Gospel, on the other hand, Jesus pre-exists. Let's contrast it with Luke first, anyway. Because we want to particularly trust the crucifixion story. So in this Gospel, Jesus is God from birth, virgin birth, of course. This is where the Christmas story is, okay? Gospel was written quite some time after Mark, okay? So you could argue that that's an example of myth-making, exaggeration with time, that Mark, the earliest Gospel, is really quite concise, and it doesn't have a lot of the sort of mythological elements the later ones have got, whereas as you go forwards through Luke and then finally to John, things get more and more mythological. Okay, so let's move on to the crucifixion. So in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is not silent. He knows, and he is 100% on board with the plan. From himself, /God, /his father, it gets very complicated. So he meets some women weeping on the way to the cross and stops, saying, "Don't cry for me, you cry for yourselves in Israel." Then as he's nailed to the cross, he forgives those who are doing it. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," which is obviously a phrase that we remember well from the Bible. We also get my favourite bit of the Bible here, which is the criminals. Okay, so one of them, just to remind you, there's a criminal on each side of Jesus, and one of them's starting to mock Jesus, saying, get off the cross and save us as well, etc. But the other one is not on board with this. And the other one rebukes the other criminal. And Jesus, he then turns to Jesus and says to him, "Jesus, remember me when you come into my kingdom, when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." So then finally Jesus dies, but before he ends his mission, he has one last line to say. He says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Now this is a completely different account to Mark. It's completely different. Now they can't both be right, so which is? And more importantly, isn't it much more likely in a situation where you've got 4 different accounts that in fact none of them are right, and that actually something completely different happened, or in fact something that was extremely trivial happened, but that over time what's happened is that this story has risen up about it. So isn't it much more likely that these holy books, which are the basis for the entire Christian faith, are Chinese whispers of Chinese whispers, written down by Christians years later who had their own agendas and had heard different stories, then copied and copied and copied and copied, errors being copied in, some accidental, some with the purpose of clarifying the purpose meanings of Jesus' words, some possibly maliciously to malign certain groups, such as the Jews. So if we have no idea what Jesus actually said or believed about himself, or what the disciples themselves believed, then we've got nothing to base this religion on, and we're putting faith in a broken process. Now, sorry, but I'm going to get a little bit angry here. If the God of the Bible really exists and is really all-powerful, why would he give us this ridiculous excuse for a holy document? And then why would he say, if he did that, believe in this or die? When he must surely know that the document he's given us are riddled with mistakes and inconsistencies, and they do not stand up to proper historical scrutiny. They're asking for blind faith, and no loving God could possibly expect this of his children. No, I think there's a far more simple explanation. It's a work of people. People who, for the most part, thought they were doing the right thing, truly believe what they're writing, but in doing so, they accidentally deified an apocalyptic Jewish prophet. There were loads of other apocalyptic Jewish prophets around at the time who've got very, very similar stories to the Jesus story. Okay? Just like there were lots of Robin Hoods around at the Robin Hood time as well. The real Jesus probably never thought he was God, but we can't be sure what he thought. That's the important thing, because we don't have any reasonable source material. Even if he thought he was God, the Bible we have is not evidence enough that he actually was God, as it's Chinese whispers of Chinese whispers, mistake on mistake, forgery upon forgery. Now this for me was enough to end my faith last year. Because there'd be no faith, in my opinion, if it has to be based on such a shaky and unreliable foundation as the New Testament documents. But as I've done all the way through this, I want to just assume for a minute that everything I've just said is wrong. So let's pretend that this highly flawed process somehow has given us the real words of Jesus, that we've got real eyewitness accounts of the miracles, we've got eyewitness accounts of people believing they'd seen Jesus after his death, and that is pretty conclusive. Well, I don't agree, and I'm going to argue that even if every single thing in the Bible is eyewitness, and that we can actually trust the documents to have got to us in a reasonable way, that there's not a strong enough basis for devoting your short, unique life to it, nor trying to commit, even worse, your children's life to it. Now, to look into this, I need to ask anyone who's listening to this who's a Christian to just for a minute try to pretend they're not. I think that's incredibly difficult to do, okay? But I'm going to ask you to just try. So, for instance, if you're a Christian reading it, just consider Islam. Now, I know you might not know very much about Islam, and I'll admit that I don't know anywhere near as much about Islam as I do about Christianity. But what I do know is they've got miracle claims. So, are these miracle claims true? Well, you, as a Christian, believe that the miracle claims in the Bible are true on the basis of, despite everything we just talked about there. Muslims believe that the miracle stories in the Quran are true. So how do you know that they're not true? It's unlikely you've studied them. So is it not the case that you're dismissing them out of hand? Now, just think a little bit further. If you'd been born in Saudi Arabia and not the UK, then you'd almost certainly be a Muslim. Because if you look at this, actually, where you're born in the world is by far the biggest determiner of what faith you have, okay? Which suggests that these are things which, not that it's impossible to reason someone into a faith or reason them out of it, but that the biggest predictor by a long way is where you're born. So, as a result of that, if you were born in the wrong place, would you now be going to hell because of where you were born? Wouldn't you believe that Christians are wrong? And wouldn't you just dismiss the gospel miracles of barely a thought, just like you are dismissing the Quran miracles without a thought? So what I'm going to say there is that in that case, are you not just as much an atheist about other religions as I am about all of them? And shouldn't we be able to use the same rational reasoning that we're using there when we innately accept that other religions' miracles were impossible to make the same assumption about the miracles in our own religion? So let's see where that leaves us. Because you see, we actually have accounts happening right now of miracles from living eyewitnesses every day. Yeah, we did miss these out of hand, quite correctly. Good example would be, there was a man called Safia Sai Baba, and this is a guy who you probably never heard of. He's not a fringe figure, though. About 20 years ago, this chap had a birthday party and about 1 million devotees showed up, okay, who is a guru in India, okay? He died recently in 2011, So 2,000 years more recently than Christ. Okay, so this evidence. This has been like people have got stuff about him on smart. People have recorded this guy doing stuff on smartphones and things. Okay, his Hindu followers ascribed all the sorts of miracles that surrounded Christ to him. So born of a virgin, walks on water, turning drink and food into other things, curing diseases. And he's not alone. There are many other people living today who have followers who 100% believe that their leader is a living God and believe that they've done exactly the sort of miracles that Christ does in the Bible. So why on earth is it then that we're happy to base our lives on material from 2,000 years ago that is almost certainly not eyewitness material, where if we get given eyewitness material from today about exactly the same miracle claims, we don't even think about them, they don't even get on TV? The answer's pretty simple, I think. We know that what they're saying is almost certainly not true. We're innately sceptical because we know we've never seen miracles like this, and so we distrust people who say that they have, and we demand some proper proof for it. But somehow, the same miracle occurring amongst mainly pre-literate people 2,000 years ago, before the invention of the printing press, can lead to 2 millennia later, half the world saying they believe it, and that half the world devoting their life to it, and, even worse, devoting their children's lives to it. And this makes no sense. So just to summarise before we start the film, I've argued that Christianity is not a helpful belief system, but I've also shown it's completely irrelevant to the question of whether Christianity is true. I've argued the Bible's inconsistent and riddled with errors and forgeries, that the Gospel accounts are Chinese whispers written down years after the events and then copied many times with the errors being magnified. But I've also argued that even if you don't accept this, that you are treating the Bible differently to other ancient sources and differently to modern eyewitnesses when they claim miracles about other religions. If the miracles of Jesus were happening today and you heard about them from a living eyewitness, you'd probably not believe them. How else do you spend your life trying to work out whether any New Age prophets are the real deal or not? So a lot of people, this is essentially the end of my manifesto, so to speak. Just to answer a very common complaint I think that people would get at that point is say that but Christianity gives my life meaning. And as I said before, there's really no reason that just because it gives your life meaning that it therefore has to be right. But I also want to point out that atheism isn't bleak, okay? What is bleak is believing that you'll have eternal life in heaven forever whilst people you love are tortured, okay? So just imagine this, okay? You're a Christian, right? You've got 2 children. You raise them as Christians, but in their 20s they leave the faith. You spend years trying to reach them and show them why they should turn back to Christ. But then one day you die, a bit of a surprise, big heart attack. You arrive in heaven, and you're unsure of whether your children ever repented and returned to Christ. The first question you ask God is where your children are. And he looks sad, and he says that they didn't believe. So your heart sinks, and you ask if you can see them. He nods slowly, and he leads you over to a place where you can see down into hell, right? And there you see one of your children roasting in a lake of sulphur, and another having their skin peeled off, and they're screaming. Now this will happen forever. And you turn to God, and you go, please, God, isn't anything I can do? And you're thinking, I'd give up my place here for them. But you haven't said it because you don't know if you can. And then God shakes his head, and he says, no. They made their choice, but don't worry about them. Come and worship me forever. Just let that sink in. This is not the work of a loving God. It's a twisted, medievalist worldview that we've tried to adjust to fit our current morals. But ultimately, we can't get away from the fact that the Bible preaches a love that would by current standards be domestic abuse. Love me, or here are the consequences. So I will stop the film now and again when I need to argue about points. I will occasionally argue over it if need be, but I think it's very important that we can listen to the film alongside this as well. I'm very happy to respond to any of your comments. Please have a look at my blog. And without further ado, let's have a look at the case for Christ.
I just thought the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving creator of the universe was just an absurd idea on the surface of it. It wasn't even worth my time to check out. As far as Jesus was concerned, I thought that if he existed, and I wasn't sure whether or not he ever did, he was probably a nice guy, he was probably an excellent teacher, but he certainly wasn't the Messiah, and he certainly wasn't the Son of God. Now, my wife was more in spiritual neutral. She was more of an agnostic, whereas I was more antagonistic toward Christians.
I just didn't know where all the pieces fit together. I didn't know who Jesus was or how he fit into the picture. Lee was antagonistic towards God. I was simply confused.
There really was no room for God in my relationship with Leslie when we were dating and when we got married, but you know what? We were happy. We didn't have any problem with that.
When I first started going to church, Lee responded very negatively. He basically told me that this is not what he had signed up for, that when we had gotten married, he had life planned in a way that did not involve church.
My biggest fear with Leslie was that she was going to turn into some religious prude or something, and I thought nothing good can possibly come out of this. But even though I had all these negative ideas of things that were going to happen, in the ensuing months I began to see positive changes in her character and in her values and the way she related to me and the children. And it was winsome and it was attractive. And so when she invited me to go to church with her on January the 20th of 1980, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go. Get her out of this cult, that she's gotten involved in.
He did go in with his reporter's notebook so he could take notes and try to find the scandal.
Well, the pastor gave a talk that day called Basic Christianity, and he just systematically laid out what it is that Christians believe. And my mind was blown because I had all these misconceptions, and he really did straighten me out on a lot of things. And I remember walking out that day saying two things. First of all, I was still an atheist. He didn't convince me that day that God exists. But secondly, I realized if this is true, this has huge implications for my life.
Lee's approach was very different from mine. Mine was mostly a heart issue. I wanted to know that God was real, and the way that was real for me was experientially. And for Lee, it was more about documentation, about being able to have facts that proved it true.
Well, I was a journalist, so there was really no problem with me picking up the phone and calling a scholar and saying, hey, I'm Lee Strobel, I'm with the Chicago Tribune. I'd like some background information about the New Testament. And so I would do that, and I thought it was going to be so easy to expose the fallacious thinking behind Christianity. But as it turned out, it took me almost 2 years of my life to investigate these issues. It really was, in a sense, the most exciting story I'd ever pursued as a journalist.
So I'm just going to pause there for a second and say that I really do see where Lee's coming from here in terms of this. Looking into this is very exciting, and if you haven't looked into this for yourself, please don't take my word or Lee's word for it. Look into it yourself. There's lots of ways of doing that. It's really important, I think, for you to come to your own conclusions about this. And I definitely shared Lee's excitement both when I was becoming a Christian and also when I was leaving it as well.
I think, unfortunately, because the documents, the New Testament and specifically, were written so far after Jesus' death, that it's really hard to say.
I don't know if myself that it was real. I was not there, but people were there at that time. So their account of things that happened back 2,000 years ago has been passed down.
As an attorney, I rely on evidence, and so, it would be tough to get evidence at this late date.
Well, I began my investigation by looking at the gospel accounts. How did I know that the New Testament was telling me the truth when it talked about Jesus? Now, obviously, I didn't accept the New Testament as being the inspired Word of God. I certainly didn't accept it as being inerrant. But what I had to accept it as being, which it undeniably is a set of ancient historical documents. And I knew that historians had criteria that they could apply to determine whether or not these documents are trustworthy. So those are the kind of people who I pursued. I went after the heavy hitters. I went after the expert witnesses who could help me sort through these issues.
J.P. Moreland, Biola University.
Interested to see if he brings out Bart Ehrman.
Mark Strauss, Bethel Seminary. Craig Blomberg, Denver Seminary. Craig Evans, Acadia Divinity College. N.T. Wright, Bishop of Durham, United Kingdom.
Okay, it's just important to point out that all of these theologians all have extremely similar beliefs about the gospel, and what would be interesting is whether Lee brings in anyone later who's got different views to this. Certainly, if I was a journalist, I'd want to make sure I represent both sides of the story, and I hope that Lee does that.
And indeed into many Christian circles, many church circles, where they'll say, well, Matthew probably made this bit up, or Luke just added this bit on the end of the parable, or whatever it is. I and others have spent some of the best years of our lives researching what was actually going on in Palestine in the first third of the first century AD, and trying to get inside the minds of first century Jews, first century Romans, different Jewish parties and movements, etc., etc. And the more that I have tried to do that, the more I've found that what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John comes up in 3 dimensions and says, my goodness, this actually belongs, it makes sense, it fits, it gives us very vivid portraits of who these people were and what they were doing.
Surely that would be the case whoever wrote it at the end of the day, as long as it was written then. It doesn't prove that it was written by the disciples of Jesus.
Throughout his ministry, they would have personally observed most of the events they described in their Gospels. Mark and Luke were also contemporaries of Jesus and wrote their biographies based upon information provided by many eyewitnesses.
I knew from my years as a legal journalist the importance of eyewitness testimony. In fact, the first question that anybody asks is, how many eyeballs are there? How many eyewitnesses do you actually have? And I needed to determine whether or not contemporary scholars have ascertained whether or not the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony.
It's become evident to scholars of the first century that the Gospels were actually attempts to write biographies of Jesus. Now, not in the modern sense, because the Gospels are not particularly interested in his early years. But when it comes to Jesus' adult life and his activities, these are biographies. They're very clearly attempts by eyewitnesses to describe exactly what Jesus said and did, and the consensus of New Testament scholarship has moved in that direction.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 and 2.
So very important, this does not show
It's
us
actually one of
that
the
these are
finest Greek
eyewitnesses.
sections in the whole New Testament. Luke was clearly a literary artist. But in that prologue, he points out that he has carefully investigated the material that he presents in the Gospels, that he's checked with eyewitness accounts, those who are actually present. If you read that prologue and you see this is the work of a historian, this was someone who has done his research.
But we still have no idea if the people he spoke to were in fact actual eyewitnesses or not, or whether the information that we have in Luke is in fact what Luke even wrote down.
To write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke chapter 1, verses 3 and 4.
You have to understand that people in the first century valued eyewitness testimony. And this is why, from the 2nd century on, it was important to the early church fathers that the people who were alleged to have written the Gospels actually wrote them, and that they were eyewitnesses of the things they wrote.
We have actually very early attestation of the authorship of the Gospels. The early church father Papias, for example, as recorded by the church historian Eusebius, identifies Mark's Gospel as essentially the eyewitness account of Peter.
Whoa, got to stop you there, dude. Okay, so unfortunately that is not the only reading of Papias. So Papias's comments on this are very scanty. Other scholars feel that it's quite likely that they're referring to completely different Gospels to Matthew and Mark. Papias is not clear exactly which Gospels he's talking about, and also bear in mind here that we don't have the actual words of Papias. We've got the words of someone else writing about Papias. So at the end of the day, this is not particularly convincing evidence that these Gospels were in fact written by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. As I say, in 200 AD we get the first appearance of that in Irenaeus, and as I've said already, even if you had attestations much earlier than Irenaeus, the fact that the Gospels were written in Greek, in rhetorical Greek, makes it highly unlikely that they were written by illiterate peasants.
Well, Papias was a disciple of the Apostle John, so we are only one generation removed from Jesus himself. That's a pretty close testimony, and strongly suggesting that, in fact, the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts.
Now, of course, it's not what you would have seen if you had a video camera there, because, after all, if you put a video camera on a street corner, even in Washington, you'd get politicians coming to and fro. You wouldn't actually have a story that would make sense. You'd have a string of random, unsorted events. That doesn't mean that none of it happened, that it's all made up. It's just to acknowledge what is blindingly obvious, that it has been edited and no doubt shaped by the needs of the community, because people tell the sort of stories that they want to tell, because this matters to us urgently here and now.
Here.
Most historians date Jesus' birth between the years 7 and 4 BC, and his death no later than AD 33. Jesus' public ministry began with the choosing of his disciples and lasted approximately 3 years, culminating in the Passion Week and his trial and death. Scholars generally agree that the Gospel of Mark was written first, sometime between the years 60 and 75 in the 1st century.
I'm quite
Matthew and
happy with
Luke
those
were
dates.
probably authored shortly after, followed by the Gospel of John.
Now, my understanding is the Gospel of John is far more towards the end of
The New
that
Testament
range,
Gospels
95
are
AD
by far
onwards.
our earliest
Certainly,
and most
that's
reliable
what the
records
vast majority of
Jesus
scholars think.
Nazareth. All of the New Testament Gospels were written in the 1st century. Not only are they remarkably close to the events themselves, but in fact, eyewitnesses are still around. If they were passing on untruths, if they were not passing on reliable history, then we would expect eyewitnesses to say, wait a minute, this isn't what happened. But eyewitnesses are around. Eyewitnesses could confirm what they said. All of the gospel writers either were eyewitnesses or interviewed eyewitnesses.
Whoa. Isn't that a massive leap to make, to say that that means that the Gospels have to be eyewitness accounts? Isn't it more likely that there were lots and lots of stories floating around about this remarkable man, just like there are about Robin Hood at the time, and that these are collected down by different people and written into collections of stories? I don't deny that the Gospel writers may well have thought they were speaking to eyewitnesses and that they were getting eyewitness accounts, but we don't know that they were. We've got no evidence they were, and everything we know about the way that stories are transmitted, particularly epic, extraordinary stories like this, is that they're exaggerated and they're changed, particularly over long periods of time. I know that 30 years might not seem a long period of time, but 30 years is a very, very long period of time when you haven't got any other real way of recording what actually happened.
To gain the information that they gained about Jesus Christ.
As I scrutinized the gospel accounts even further, I realized that it was important to find out not just whether or not the information was rooted in direct and indirect eyewitness testimony, but I needed to know, was this information reliably preserved during the time period before it was finally written down?
I completely agree with you, Lee. That's very important.
We have to put ourselves into the ancient world without modern media, without even a print-based culture in which the only and the standard way of preserving information was through oral tradition, most of which was memorized.
Young rabbis were often forbidden to comment on a passage of Scripture until they had memorized it perfectly. In fact, it was not uncommon for rabbis of Jesus' time to commit the entire Torah to memory.
I've sometimes heard people say, look, I've been in a situation where I whisper something to someone, they whisper it to someone else, and it goes through 10 or 11 people, and by the time the last person tells what was said, it's totally different from what I told the first person. And we can't trust the Gospels for the same reason, because it was transmitted over a long period of time. That illustration is really a bad analogy, and you have to understand that the first century apostles who passed on information about Jesus were deeply concerned to get this information correct, because they saw it as sacred holy tradition. It wasn't about what Joe was eating for dinner last Wednesday night.
Okay, so let's say that you're right there. I can't remember that guy's name. If that's the case, why is it that there's lots of differences between the different Gospels? Also, you seem to somehow be suggesting that ancient people were much, much better at doing this than we are now. There's no evidence that that's the case, and all the research that we have got, based on tribes that still work in this way, shows that they're no better at doing this than we are now. There's no reason to believe that people would have been better at it then. And so this is not particularly good evidence that we were good at oral transmission. It may be that we were better at remembering things then because we couldn't write them down, but it still seems that very likely that stories, when they were passed from person to person, would have changed, much in the same way that they do now. As I said before, even in the event that the real words of that occurred at the time of Jesus somehow made it into the Bible, that still is not good enough evidence that Jesus is God. However, I do not think there is strong evidence presented so far in this that these are reliable eyewitness accounts. But I'm interested to hear on and see what comes next.
In our day of instant media and everything has to be on film or tape recorded, we are more skeptical of oral tradition, but we don't really understand the nature of oral tradition. Oral tradition is a community event.
We've done research about it.
A story is passed down by individuals within that community. Well, if they get it wrong, you've got an entire community that's going to correct them. So it is
again, research shows that's not the
way.
case.
These stories were passed on reliably because they were passed on by the community of disciples.
In fact, we now have scholarly studies that have been done of oral cultures, and we know that through several generations, oral tradition can be preserved and passed on without changing a thing.
Right,
Even
I
though
really
became
need a
convinced
reference for that,
ancient
because
cultures
everything
could
I've looked
pass
at shows
along
that's
oral
not the
tradition
case.
reliably over time, I still had an obvious objection to the New Testament, and that was,
I'm
isn't it
still
really
not seeing
filled with
any
contradiction?
references.
One of the issues people often raise is the question of apparent contradictions between the Synoptic Gospels, where there's a parallel story. For example, Matthew tells the story of 2 blind men being healed, whereas in Mark's account there's only 1 blind man. How can we get this contradiction? The vast majority of these apparent contradictions, however, are quite easily resolved. Mark describes only one of the 2 blind men, the one who is most prominent, obviously, or perhaps even the one who became a disciple of Jesus and became prominent in the later church. So most of these apparent contradictions are quite easily resolved.
What like some of the other contradictions, such as what day did Jesus die on? Did he die before Passover or after Passover? No, obviously this guy would say that he died twice. That's obviously the most likely explanation of that. Also, what about Jesus' crucifixion? We've already talked about that, haven't we? Was he basically entirely silent through the whole thing and then basically said, my God, why have you forsaken me," and died? Or was he fully understanding of exactly what was going on, and did he sort of bless and try to save people while he was on the cross? They can't both be right. I'm sorry. That argument there is extremely facetious.
Had every single account given us exactly the same detail, we might have accused them of some form of collusion, of having gotten together and carefully planned out how they were always going to tell the story with the exact number of details, but then one doesn't have independent testimony at all.
So I think you probably know the story of Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. So in Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, there's some porridge which is too hot, some porridge which is too cold, and some porridge which is just right. I think that this is quite a good analogy for this here. So what they're saying is that if you've got too much similarity between all the Gospels, that would be really bad. It would show that there's collusion and that they've been sort of worked on together. Like, witness testimony might be, done today in a crime where people are trying to have the same story. So how much variation is right? What's just right there? Do we want just a little bit of variation? Do we want a lot of variation? Is it in fact possible that the amount of variation that's in the Bible just happens to be exactly the right amount of variation? So you can't see my inverted commas fingers during all this. Who's to say exactly what the right amount of variation is, apart from Bible apologists who want to say that this is exactly the right degree of variation? Are you seriously telling me that in the event that these Gospels did not have these contradictions, that they'd be there going, ooh, I wish they had more contradictions so they looked more true? I think this is simply a way of trying to explain away something in the way that you would do if you truly wanted to believe it, which requires you to come from already believing it and from looking inside Christianity and trying to prove that it's right rather than looking at it objectively.
It's natural when you have multiple eyewitnesses to the same event. You're going to get different perspectives, and that's okay. You want that. What you're looking for is a core to the testimony that's the same, that's consistent, even though there may be some variation in the incidental details. If you're in a court of law and you have multiple witnesses come in and testify to the exact same thing, the first objection that's brought up is to say collusion. They got together. They orchestrated their testimony, and their credibility is shot.
The earliest known copies of the Gospels were written on sheets of papyrus and scrolls made of animal skins. They are among the oldest existing manuscripts of antiquity. The Codex Sinaiticus was authored between AD 330 and 350. It contains almost all of the New Testament and a significant portion of the Old, while the Codex Vaticanus from the same era is a nearly complete Greek copy of the entire Bible. A papyrus fragment from the 18th chapter of John dates to AD 125, less than a single generation after the Gospel was originally written.
So in short, there really isn't very much at all contemporaneous writing regarding Jesus. What we see are copies of copies of copies from many years later. Essentially, we're talking about the first really significant copies, which have got large portions of these writings appearing in around 200 AD. That's a large period of time. I'm not trying to say that they were written then. I fully accept the dating, saying they were written not that long after Jesus' death, but we don't have those original copies. We don't know what they actually said.
When I found out that we have no original survivors of the manuscripts of the New Testament, I became very skeptical. Because if all we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, then how do we know that what we possess today bears any resemblance to what the original said?
We have better manuscript attestation for the New Testament than any other ancient document. For example, the Bible of the Greeks, Homer's Iliad, is preserved in maybe 600 manuscripts, the oldest of them 1,000 years after the document was actually written. The New Testament, we have something like 5,000 Greek manuscripts. So everyone agrees, whether liberal or conservative, that we have an incredibly reliable New Testament.
I'm sorry, this guy's really pissing me off now. Are you kidding? We've got 5,000 copies. Yeah, I'm quite happy to accept that we have a very large number of documents here, okay? And we have way, way more than the Iliad, right? Let's just touch on the Iliad for a second. The Iliad is not trying to tell you that you have to believe in it or go to hell, and that you have to live your life in certain ways, and that potentially that you have to completely change your life in order to believe it, and live in ways which are completely, in some ways, self-denying, and essentially squander your short life chasing this. Quite happy. I'm also quite happy to accept that the Iliad may well not be what was originally written down. It's certainly quite possible. I don't think that particularly matters, because the Iliad isn't trying to get us to believe in a religion. At the end of the day, he says here that the fact that there are this many copies is extremely good evidence of the reliability. But if you look at other scholars, they'll very clearly point out that there are more differences between all of these than there are words in the New Testament. That is not particularly good. It certainly doesn't show us that these are reliable documents. There are two sides to each story.
We have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. We also have virtually the entire New Testament preserved in the quotations of the Church Fathers in the first 4 centuries, so that if we had no copies of the New Testament, we could reconstruct the New Testament from quotations from the early Church Fathers.
Yes, and I could reconstruct Tolkien's Lord of the Rings from things that people have written about it. It doesn't mean that it would be the original text. Interestingly, all that he's suggesting here as well is it would be possible to recreate some semblance of the New Testament that we have in our hands from what was written by the early Church Fathers, say, between 200 and 400 AD, etc. I think that's probably true. We probably do have enough information to do that. But as I'm saying already, we've got really good reason to suspect that the New Testament that we hold in our hands, that the early Church Fathers also had, is not what actually happened, and it's Chinese whispers of Chinese whispers. So to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter whether we can recreate that or not from what's in the early Church Fathers. It seems to be, to me, irrelevant to the matter at hand.
Following the pattern of my investigation, my next step was to determine whether or not there was any evidence outside the New Testament that corroborates what the New Testament tells us.
Jesus, of course, wasn't the emperor of the Roman Empire. He wasn't some autocrat that had conquered half of the world, but he did leave an impact in his own environment and created a movement that grew from there. And there is a remarkable amount of documents and corroboration. Josephus refers to him.
Widely considered to be a forgery.
Tacitus refers to him. Suetonius,
widely considered to be a forgery.
the political writer, refers to him.
Widely considered to be a forgery.
Critics refer to him. And so it's like a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples go out, and everywhere are felt. It's a very impressive record taken as a whole.
Really? I don't consider that to be particularly impressive. I mean, you could say exactly the same thing about Robin Hood at the end of the day, and no one really thinks that the exact stories of Robin Hood are what happened. There are people who may be watching this who think there's a case that Jesus didn't even exist. I'm not going to go that far. I think it's very likely that Jesus was a historical person. But having little bits of possible evidence from outside people that Jesus existed does not prove that Jesus was the Son of God or that any of the miracles that are recorded in the Bible actually happened. As I said there, all of those sources that he said have been considered by many scholars to be forgeries. That doesn't necessarily mean they are, but I am a bit concerned that in this, what appears to be so far quite one-sided documentary, that the fact that there are other views about that are not put forwards.
In AD 93, the Jewish historian Josephus published his work, Antiquities of the Jews. Scholars generally agree that the following text accurately records Josephus' record of Jesus.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles.
He's done my work for me. I was originally going to actually have a look on the internet and see if I could find the quote from Josephus, because I couldn't quite remember it when I was talking before, but there it is. Now, if you look at that, right, Josephus was Jewish, okay? He was not a Christian, okay? He was a Jewish historian. Doesn't it seem a little bit weird that he seems to be fully all over Jesus in that? Like, he was a doer of wonderful works, how awesome was he? Well, Josephus didn't believe that he was the Son of God. And this very much appears to be inserted into a section of Josephus where it's sort of out of context. So it does look like it may well have been added by someone later on to try to give more historical background to Jesus. Obviously, I can't prove that, but I think it's very important to bear in mind that there are scholars, and I think the majority of scholars from what I've read, who would say that Josephus is likely to be a forgery.
When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct to this day.
In a court of law, the rebuttal case is an opportunity for the other side to present their evidence. Well, in recent years, there's been a proliferation of books and articles about the so-called Gnostic Gospels. And I wanted to figure out, does this represent the mainstream of academic scholarship?
The Gnostic Gospels are a collection of religious writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They blend the teachings of Jesus with a variety of ancient philosophical beliefs. According to the tenets of Gnosticism, the universe was the creation of a flawed and wicked God. Therefore, all matter was evil. Salvation from this world could only be attained through secret knowledge about the spiritual nature of man.
There's been a lot of talk about the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas. These documents are almost universally recognized to be much later than the New Testament Gospels and not to record historically reliable material related to Jesus.
Well, the New Testament
I
Gospels
100% agree with all of
give us a portrait
that.
of
Why
a
does he not
early
use the
first-century
same reasoning
Palestinian
to look at
Jesus
the
of
Gospels that
Nazareth?
he considers to be
The Gospels from
canonical
the 2nd
and
century,
appreciate that they
which
may
are
also
mostly
not
Gnostic
record what really
Gospels,
happened
such
in
as
the
Gospel
time of
of
Jesus
Judas,
for the same
or the
reason that he
Gospel of
discounts
Thomas,
the
or
Gospels that are the Gnostic
Philip,
Gospels.
or the Gospel of Mary. They give us a very different Jesus.
So do the Gospels
Now,
of
you can
Mark
pick
and John.
choose
They
if
give
you
a very
want. You
different
can say,
Jesus
well,
between
I like
the two.
the 2nd century Gnostic Jesus better. Others might want the early 1st century Palestinian Jesus. But if you're going to be a scholar about it, and you're going to talk about, well, which Gospels really do give us earlier traditions that more reliably reflect the actual historical Jesus, you got to go with the New Testament Gospels every time.
Yes, I'd agree. The the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, are far more likely to represent some truth about what was going on in those days than the Gnostic Gospels, which were written a long time afterwards. But I just can't see why you can't use the same reasoning to appreciate that there's high likelihood that what we've got in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John is very little to do with what really happened at the time. They're still separated significantly in time from the events that took place, and the process by which the information got to us is not in any way clear. And the most likely explanation is that it's an oral tradition that's been altered through Chinese whispers, and that explains the variation between the Jesuses that we find in the Gospels, particularly between Mark and John, if you care to have a read of the two side by side.
There's a view among some that there were all of these different competing views of Jesus Christ, and that the one that won out became the orthodox perspective of Christ reflected in the Gospels. All the evidence runs contrary to that. Jesus was a first-century Jewish teacher who revealed and demonstrated himself to be the Messiah. That's the presentation we get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the New Testament Gospels. These later Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, present a very different Jesus, almost a Greek philosopher, an esoteric Gnostic Jesus. It's clearly not the authentic historical Jesus.
What I've come to discover is that the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are our best sources for Jesus. And I've also found that they are reliable, and that from these sources we can form a picture that I believe is very accurate, that tells us about Jesus, what he taught, how he was perceived by his contemporaries, and what his life was really all about.
I wish I could speak to this guy here and just ask him this question, because I'm sure he's got a response to it. But how does he know? Because he's saying that he thinks that the Gospels are accurate, and he's happy that they give a good report of what happened at the time. Well, I'd love to see his reasoning for that, and I'd also really like to see how he knows that the Quran isn't the true word of God and doesn't describe exactly what was said to Muhammad, because I'm pretty certain he probably doesn't believe that, but I cannot see how he can show that that didn't happen, yet still say that the Gospels are correct, because the reasoning that's used for one should apply to the other.
Everything from Jesus' parables, to his healings, to his controversies, to his warnings, and all of that, the reason they were telling this stuff is that not just it was good advice for them in their own day, but that it actually mattered, that it actually happened. And if it hadn't happened, you're into a totally different worldview, a worldview which is about ideas, which is about self-realization, hugely popular in our culture just now, discovering who I really am. You know, for goodness sake, Jesus didn't come to help me discover who I really am. He came to tell me who he knew I really was and to do something about it. And that's much better news.
Well, apart from being quite sinister, that really doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Where's he getting this information from? As I've said multiple occasions here, we have very little reasonable evidence to believe that what happened in the Gospels was actually what occurred at the time, that the words of Jesus were the real words of Jesus. So making such a significant claim as that on that level of evidence seems completely insane, and a very tenuous thread on which to base the decisions you make in your life.
After a while, as the evidence would accumulate more and more, it was like there were these scales and they began to tip increasingly. And I began to go from a hard-hearted, cynical atheist to someone who was still skeptical, but who was more open-minded, maybe more of a spiritual seeker, someone who was willing to follow the evidence wherever it took me. This whole time I was on this investigative journey, Leslie and her friends behind the scenes were praying because they knew that I was checking into the evidence. I was looking into these issues for myself, and they just wanted me to be open-minded about the evidence that I found.
I was feeling like my whole world was opening up into something new and way more exciting and fulfilling than what we had been on. And it was that frustration of trying to help him to recognize that that was the case.
Well, Leslie tried several things during this period to try to spur me on in my investigation. It didn't help very much. For instance, she would leave Bible tracts around the house, or she would take a Christian book and highlight certain passages and leave it open on a coffee table, things like that. And it really didn't help, and I told her it was not helping, and she understood that. But I think sort of the whole time she was holding her breath, because this was not a very smooth investigation.
And he would take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Sometimes it looked like he was really getting it, and other times he would just turn into an angry, frustrated person again. And so it was a very frustrating time for both of us.
Sorry to interrupt here. I think this just highlights something which I've alluded to earlier on, which is that it's much, much easier to convince yourself that something's true if it has some significant impact on your life, if it is true. So, for instance, in this case, obviously I wasn't there at the time, but I suspect that the fact that Lee's wife became a Christian did mean that Lee then had to look into it, and to some extent that there would have been subconsciously, at the very least, some pressure for him to join her in that. And that isn't me trying to be horrible towards Lee, and I'm sure Lee would completely come back at me and go, oh, that wasn't the case. But it is the case generally. And that would explain why it is that what we might call, in inverted commas, Christian countries are far more likely to produce Christians growing up than Muslims growing up, because of the fact that the children now are exposed to the faith through their parents and things like that, and through their culture. Ultimately, I don't think we can ignore the fact that Lee's wife being a Christian could well have had an impact on the way he did his investigation and the way that he looked at the evidence. And we also can't ignore the fact that where you're born in the world seems to dictate what religion, if any, that you have. And as a result of that, it seems highly unlikely that one religion is true, whereas the others are false. In fact, it seems more likely that they're probably all false.
I believe Jesus was a real person. I believe he did live. I guess there are some exaggerations in the Bible, I'd have to say.
I don't believe we'll ever know if Jesus was really what everyone thinks he is. I think it's a lot of folklore. I think it's a lot of historical misrepresentations. I think it's a lot of wishful thinking. But I don't think we know, and I don't think we'll ever know, and I don't think there's any way to prove what has been claimed about Jesus for all these years.
Quick pause for a shout out for the best thing that's been said so far in this film. That is, it encapsulates the only real rational view that you can have about these documents, in my opinion.
The biographies of Jesus in the New Testament gave me a lot of information about him, but Christians were saying that he is the Son of God. That's a huge step to take to believe that. And so I sought out more scholars so I could pose to them this question: who was Jesus?
Michael Rydelnik, Moody Bible Institute. Ben Witherington, Asbury Seminary.
Now, this is one of the things I love about Jesus, and it says something to us. His identity is complex. He can't be pigeonholed. He fits no one formula. There's a lot of aspects to who he is. But always, he presents himself as a challenge to the status quo, to preconditioned thinking about what Son of God, what Messiah must be. He's carving out his own niche. He's doing his own thing like a great and creative artist. He is not simply replicating anything from the past. He is taking bits and pieces of prophecies and ideas and wisdom literature and law and you name it, and he's made a whole new gumbo. And he's serving it up, and people don't know what to think. He goes in a synagogue and says some of this stuff, and they go, wow, a new teaching, and with authority. Shazam!
Amazingly, people say, no one teaches like him because he spoke with his own authority. Our sages, our rabbis, always taught that you have to teach in the name of someone else. Rabbi so-and-so says in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. That's the way rabbis were taught to teach. Yeshua came and said, you've heard it said, but not what my rabbi taught me, but I say unto you.
And he would clarify, even overrule in some ways, the Old Testament law. Well, this law was given by God himself, for Jesus to say, I am the authoritative interpreter of the law. I am the one who has come to fulfill the law. That's an extraordinary claim, a claim to essentially the authority of God.
The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives. Isaiah 61:1.
It's interesting because when Yeshua went into the synagogue, that was the passage he read. And he says, this day, this verse is fulfilled in your hearing. And basically he's saying, I'm the servant that's described here. I'm the one who fulfills this.
Philip comes to Jesus and asks him to show us the Father, and Jesus says, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus clearly presents himself as the self-revelation of God. Those who meet Jesus are, in fact, meeting God.
When Jesus is brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, and some of the Sanhedrin members that have gathered the evening that Jesus is arrested, they're trying to find incriminating evidence. They're trying to find...
Just to quickly pause it here, I just want to quickly state that I don't really disagree with anything that's being said here. I mean, what they're doing is they're telling us the story of Jesus in the Bible, but I could tell you the story of how Frodo takes a ring from Middle-earth, from Hobbiton, and walks all the way across and drops it into Mount Doom to melt it and save the world, but that wouldn't make it be true. What I'm interested in here is whether or not the documents are going to stand up to scrutiny, and so far I don't think they do.
Incriminating testimony, and they're not doing real well. And finally, the high priest asked Jesus directly, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand, coming with the clouds of heaven. And there Jesus has combined phrases from Daniel 7 and Psalm 110. Jesus sees himself as this heavenly figure.
I don't want to take the wind out of their sails if they're going to go on to this later, so I'll just be brief for now, but it does appear that 3 times within that this idea about prophecy being fulfilled in the New Testament's come up, and that's often used by Christians as a form of evidence to try to show that the Gospels are correct, that there are things that have been predicted to happen in the Old Testament that are then fulfilled in the New Testament. But first of all, if you were to speak to Jews, obviously the Old Testament, or Muslims actually for that matter as well, who also use the Old Testament as one of their books, they would not feel that Jesus has fulfilled those. So there is a debate on that. And also, there have been quite clear instances where the Gospels appear to have been manipulated in order to try to make them fit with passages in the Old Testament to make them appear to be prophecies. So, for instance, a good example would be the virgin birth, which appears in Matthew and Luke. It's noticeably not mentioned in either Mark or John. This appears to have been due to a mistranslation of the word for young girl, which is mistranslated as virgin. And this appears to have got some of the Gospel writers, both Matthew and Luke, to write quite convoluted creative writing in order to try to make sure that the birth was in fact a virgin birth. Mark's Gospel, which is the earliest, does not seem to suggest a virgin birth. It has no reference whatsoever to one. And when Jesus starts prophesying, his own mother at first believes that he's gone mad, which would be slightly strange behaviour if you'd given birth to your son after having had an angel come down and tell you that you're about to be impregnated by God. You probably wouldn't be surprised if you started prophesying. So it's quite likely that the writer of Mark was not aware that there was meant to have been a virgin birth. Just going along the same lines, really, in Luke's Gospel, there's this interesting convolution to try to get Jesus to go to Bethlehem to be born, and this is because it was felt that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and therefore it was particularly important to the writer of Luke that this was the case. As a result, we have this story about a census that meant people had to go back to the place of their birth to register. There's no historical evidence that such a census ever took place. And also, can you imagine what an upheaval such a census would be, that you had to make every single person in the known Roman world return to the village of their birth to register for the census? First of all, I mean, that would be insane. I mean, it would shut down the whole of Europe for about a week, 2 weeks, minimum. And then also, what's the point? Why do you want a census record of people going back to the place that they were born? There's no sense. The only reason that this is in the story, surely, is so that Jesus can be born in Bethlehem, regardless of the fact that the vast majority of people were fully aware at this time that Jesus was very much associated with Nazareth. And this is another example of the words of the Bible potentially being changed and twisted in order to make them appear more legitimate by making them align with passages in the Old Testament that early Christians believed to be prophecies regarding Christ.
More than 80 times in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus is identified as the Son of Man. While the human connotations of the phrase are obvious, a broader interpretation is found in an Old Testament scripture written by the Jewish prophet Daniel.
In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Daniel 7:13.
Many Christians and non-Christians alike hear the phrase Son of Man. They think Son of God refers to his deity and Son of Man refers to his humanity. That's in part true, but in fact, Son of Man has a much greater significance than that as well. The title Son of Man, Jesus draws that title from Daniel chapter 7, where a glorious messianic figure comes before the Ancient of Days, a reference to God, and he is given all glory and power and majesty. That portrait of this glorious Messiah is the one that Jesus identifies himself with. He is the Son of Man. So Son of Man doesn't just mean a human being.
Okay, so you believe that happened. Why do you not believe that the Archangel Gabriel came down and dictated the whole of Quran to Muhammad, who then wrote it down, and that became the basis for the Quran? What evidence do you have that what you're saying there regarding Daniel and regarding what you believe to be a prophecy and regarding then what Jesus was said to have done in the New Testament, what evidence have you got that that's correct, and what process have you used to determine that's correct, and at the same time determine that Gabriel did not come down and speak to Muhammad, or any other revelation in any other religion for that matter?
His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Daniel 7:14.
Actually, the phrase Son of Man refers to his humanness and his more than humanness. Because no human being can rule forever unless he's a forever person in some kind of way.
In addition to the claims that Jesus makes about himself in the New Testament, there are also reports that he performed the miraculous, that he walked on water and healed the sick and turned water into wine and raised the dead and did exorcisms. And so I had to know, is there evidence that these miracles are a result of his divine nature?
Jesus' contemporaries, that is, people who liked him, people who were indifferent, neutral, and people who opposed him, all acknowledged he did extraordinary things. Now, of course, the people who liked Jesus and believed in him and followed him said Jesus did these powerful works because of the Spirit of God. People who opposed him would say, well, I admit he does these amazing things, but it's because the devil is helping him.
I might propose a third way here, which is that it may appear that he does amazing things, but that these amazing things either did not occur or there are simple rational explanations for these amazing things. We have to have quite significant evidence of a supernatural cause for us to assume that a supernatural cause is the most likely explanation for what's spoken about Jesus in the Bible.
The Talmud actually speaks of some of these things. In some of the passages that deal with Yeshua, it has him as a magician. And why do they describe him as a magician? It's not flattering. There's a historical recognition here that when Yeshua came, he did miracles, just as Isaiah 35 indicates in the Messianic age. When the Messiah comes, he'll be able to make the blind see and the lame walk.
The New Testament Gospels record at least 40 separate miracles performed by Jesus during the course of his ministry. They include healings, exorcisms, mastery over nature, and even raising of the dead. Christian theology has always held that these miracles are part of a total picture that displays the attributes of God himself: unlimited power, total knowledge, ever-present, unchanging, eternal.
Okay, so can someone please explain to me why it is that this is meant to be convincing evidence of Jesus' divinity? You see, we've got people nowadays who are claimed, who have followers who claim that they do miracles of this very nature, particularly in people who are following sort of Hindu gurus and things like that. And, their followers would claim that they do very similar miracles to those that Jesus did. And this is things that are happening right now. But if someone mentioned that they knew some Hindu master that was able to levitate or walk on water or raise things from the dead, they wouldn't even bother thinking or looking into it. They'd just be pretty obvious that's just not true. There has to be a more logical explanation for it. So why is it that if you then take exactly the same sort of miracles that today would just simply be ignored and just written off as clearly not being possible, if you take them to a pre-literate age, that somehow, and you write them down in a book from 2,000 years ago, that everyone around now seems to feel that this is something that they should base their entire lives around, it just doesn't make any sense.
There's no question that the biographies of Jesus describe him as a worker of mighty deeds. But I wanted to know, does this make him any different than the other miracle workers and magicians of the ancient world?
Miracle workers that we find occasionally in the first century are magicians. They use incantations, they use spells, they try to coerce gods or divine figures to work on their behalf. That's very different than Jesus' miracles. Jesus' miracles were to demonstrate the power of the kingdom of God. When he healed the sick, he pointed back to Isaiah's prophecies that when God's kingdom would come, when God's salvation would come, the lame would walk, the blind would see. This was the demonstration that God's kingdom was arriving.
He's an exorcist. You don't find any of those in the Old Testament. People were not looking for messianic exorcists. He carves out his own niche. He reveals his identity in his own way. It becomes clear that he is somebody who can take on the powers of darkness himself and win. What kind of person is that?
Okay, so my understanding of what they're trying to say here is that Jesus was very, very different to any other so-called miracle workers around that time. And I think you could use that possibly as a bit of an argument against what I just said earlier. So I'm going to argue that he really wasn't, and to do that, I hope Bart Ehrman doesn't mind this, but I am actually just going to quote a little bit from one of his books, which I've got open beside me. So this is actually the opening of How Jesus Became God. So it says here, when I teach my introductory course on the New Testament, I tell my students that it is very difficult to know where to begin our exploration. Is it best to start with our earliest author of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who wrote more of the books of the New Testament than any other author? Or is it best to start with the Gospels, which, while written after Paul, discuss the life of Jesus, who lived before Paul wrote his letters? In the end, I tell them that probably it's best to begin by telling the story of a highly unusual man who was born in the 1st century in a remote part of the Roman Empire, whose life was described by his later followers as altogether miraculous. Before he was born, his mother had a visitor from heaven who told her that her son would not be a mere mortal, but in fact would be divine. His birth was accompanied by unusual divine signs in the heavens. As an adult, he left his home to engage in an itinerant preaching ministry. He went from village to town, telling all who would listen that they should not be concerned about their earthly lives and their material goods. They should live for what was spiritual and eternal. He gathered a number of followers around him, who became convinced that he was no ordinary human, but that he was the Son of God, and he did miracles to confirm them in their beliefs. He could heal the sick, cast out demons, and raise the dead. At the end of his life, he aroused opposition amongst the ruling authorities of Rome and was put on trial, but they could not kill his soul. He ascended to heaven and continues to live there to this day. To prove that he lived on after leaving this earthly orb, he appeared again to at least one of his doubting followers, who became convinced that in fact he remains with us even now. Later, some of his followers wrote books about him, and we can still read about him today, but very few of you will have ever seen these books, and I imagine most of you do not even know who this great miracle-working Son of God was. I've been referring to a man named Apollonius, who came from the town of Tyana. He was a pagan, that is, a polytheistic worshipper of the many Roman gods, and a renowned philosopher of his day. His followers thought he was immortal. We have a book written about him by his later devotee, Philostratus. That ends the reading from Bart Ehrman. I contend that there were many people around at that time who were claiming to be divine and whose followers would claim all sorts of miracles about them, just as there are today, and that we should pay as little attention to Apollonius or to the Hindu masters as we should to the myth of Jesus Christ.
And he doesn't have to use recipes and formulas like other ancient exorcists. He can just call the demon by name and that boy's out of there.
One of the most astonishing things that Jesus did was when he claimed to forgive sins. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, a man is brought to him, a paralyzed man, and the crowds around him are expecting Jesus to heal him. But instead, the first thing Jesus said is, "Your sins are forgiven." Only God forgives sins. Now, some might say, well, Jesus may have been forgiving sins on behalf of God. But in fact, that's not the way his listeners understood him, because immediately the religious leaders responded to that. Who is this that forgives sins? Only God forgives sins, they claim. But Jesus claims the ability to forgive sins. And then to confirm that he has that authority, he then heals the man.
And so a very obvious question arises. That is Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the one sent by God to be the Savior of Israel and the world? Christians told me that there are dozens and dozens of ancient prophecies contained in the Old Testament of the Bible, and that they predict the coming of this Messiah, and that Jesus, against all mathematical odds, fulfilled those prophecies. And I thought, this is a little bit like the fingerprint evidence you see in a court of law.
Yeah, except that fingerprint evidence isn't usually sort of planted many years down the line in order to try to lead people back to a particular conclusion. Obviously, sometimes it is. That's what perjury is. But I really don't think that is an allegory that makes any real sense. Just ask the Jews whether or not the Old Testament prophecies that Christians believe are something predicting the Messiah and are fulfilled in Jesus. Ask them whether or not they think that these are anything to do with the Messiah or not. The vast majority of them will say no, or they'll explain why they don't think they point to Jesus. I'm not saying that the Jews are necessarily right there, but what I'm saying is that this is not a clear-cut case, and we'd be foolish to try to claim that this proves the divinity of Jesus.
I remember covering one particular case where the murderer went through the purse of the victim, and he left one thumbprint on the cellophane wrapper of a package of cigarettes. And it was that thumbprint that led to his conviction for murder. And I thought, in an analogous way, could it be that these ancient prophecies are sort of like that thumbprint on the cellophane? Do they create a thumbprint that only Jesus Christ in all of history manages to match?
Just like, I am really watching this film from beginning to end. I'm not flipping around it or anything like that, so this may be a completely incorrect prediction, but I am about to predict that we're about to hear a large amount of different quotes in the Old Testament taken heinously out of context.
This is Yeshayahu 53:6 or Isaiah 53:6. Kulanu katson ta'inu, ishla darko paninu, vadonai hifnia bo, et avon kulanu. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. I had a friend who wrote this out on a piece of paper. He typed it up on his computer without any verse notations. And he took it around to everyone in his office. He worked in a big office for a motor vehicle bureau in one of the big states in our country. And he showed it to everyone in the motor vehicle bureau and in the state capitol. And he said, just tell me who this is and where it comes from. And every single person that looked at it, Jew or Gentile alike, it didn't matter. Everyone that looked at it read it, and he said, who is this? They said, oh, it's obviously Jesus of Nazareth. That's who it is. And it's from the New Testament. And then my friend would say, but no, it's not from the New Testament. It's from the Hebrew Bible. It was written 8 centuries before Jesus came. Can you believe this? And he showed it to them from Isaiah. And people really had a hard time, because if you read this passage without any kind of presuppositions or bias,
or context,
you'll read it, and it will be really clear that this is the life of Yeshua. Now, could he have fabricated this, or is this just a big coincidence?
Yes, almost certainly, and it's definitely more likely than invoking a supernatural explanation for it.
In the Old Testament, we really have two kinds of prophecies. We have prophecies that are fulfilled uniquely in Christ and prophecies that are fulfilled typologically in Christ. And I do think we need to distinguish between the two. Those that are fulfilled uniquely in Christ were once and for all fulfilled by Jesus. And those are the ones that we can really point to have apologetic value. That is to demonstrate that Jesus was the only person who could have possibly fulfilled this. His birth in Bethlehem is one of those prophecies.
Oh, brilliant. Glad I covered that one earlier then. So just to recap, Jesus is not born in Bethlehem in all the Gospels. And when he is born in Bethlehem, it's in association with a very convoluted story to get him there involving a census that there's no evidence took place, and a census which is entirely nonsensical. the story looks like it's been planted there in order to ensure that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, because that is what the prophecy was meant to say about the Messiah, whereas everyone knew that Jesus was associated with Nazareth, hence why there was a need to make up a strange story to get him into Bethlehem in the first place.
His role as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is one of those prophecies. His entrance into Jerusalem on a donkey from Zechariah chapter 9.
Sorry, mate, you mentioned it, so I've got to talk about it. So Zechariah 9:9 basically says the king would come riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Okay? Now, here is a really good example that comes from this of how the gospel writers were quite clearly trying to make sure that Jesus fulfilled this. Okay? So, interestingly, you might not realise this, but in the four Gospels, there is actually some inconsistency about how many donkeys were being ridden into Jerusalem by Jesus. So in Mark, Luke and John, he rides a single donkey, but in Matthew, he rides two. It's absurd. He rides astride two donkeys. So, first of all, obviously, why is it that there's this inconsistency at all if the Bible's meant to be inerrant and the Word of God? But what's really interesting is it does seem to suggest that there was a misunderstanding about what Zechariah was meant to mean, because if you read it again, it says, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And that repetition there is really quite typical of the way that Hebrew's written. But it seems that Matthew, who obviously was not Hebrew, well, obviously he would have been, but the person who actually wrote Matthew was a later Greek speaker, doesn't really understand how Hebrew writing works, and thought that the prophecy was meant to describe the king riding both a donkey and a colt, and so as a result had to introduce a second one into the procession in order to make this fit with the prophecy. This is again another example of how these prophecies do not stand up to any real investigation.
These are clear evidence that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament.
The most amazing part of Isaiah's prophecies is in Isaiah 9 when it speaks about the son of David coming to be the king, to sit on the throne of David and have an eternal righteous kingdom. And everyone knows it from Handel's Messiah. Unto us a son is born, unto us a child is given. And the idea of this verse is that the Messiah will actually be born, physically born. And then it says, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity. In other words, he's the creator, the author of time.
Some skeptics have said that Jesus could have engineered the fulfillment of these prophecies. Of course, Jesus could not have determined where he was going to be born, so to be born in Bethlehem, obviously he could not have engineered that. Also, as the suffering servant, it would have been difficult for him to engineer such a specific fulfillment of Isaiah 53. But on the other hand, the fact that Jesus performed certain actions that in fact fulfilled prophecies only demonstrates that he was indeed the Messiah. Anyone who enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey in obvious fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9 is saying, yes, I am the Messiah. So we certainly have a glimpse in that fulfilled prophecy of the self-consciousness of Jesus, that he truly believed that he was the Messiah.
Scholars have determined that Jesus fulfilled at least 4 major prophecies, each written a minimum of 3 centuries before his birth. Their content ranged from specific details about his life to the symbolic implications of his death.
Psalm 22 gives a poetic picture by David, written in the first person, of what the Messiah will be like in his suffering. And one of the things he says is that they will pierce my hands and my feet. Now, David wrote before crucifixion was known, probably by about 300 years. So Isaiah 53 says he was pierced through. It gives us the reason for his death. He was pierced through for our iniquities.
Again, this is not particularly revelationary on the basis that these have been taken out of context. There's nothing to suggest that David was writing about the Messiah in that psalm. He's likely talking about himself. And the passage in Isaiah is not widely considered by Jews to be to do with the Messiah at all.
So there's a purpose. He dies not just because he's a martyr, but because he's a substitution for sin.
A college professor of mathematics and science named Dr. Peter Stoner
Now
wanted
that's
to
a
determine
good
what
name.
the odds were that any human being throughout history could fulfill the messianic prophecies. So he had his students come up with very conservative estimates of the likelihood of any human being fulfilling certain of these predictions, and then they just ran the numbers. And what they determined is that the odds of any human being fulfilling 48 of these ancient prophecies would be 1 chance in a trillion.
So in maths or physics class, we would have called this nonsense in, nonsense out. If you're putting in crazy variables that are based on nothing, the answers that you get out at the end are also equally meaningless.
It is mathematically virtually impossible.
To me, just as significant as all of those unique prophecies that were fulfilled in Christ is the complete drama of the Old Testament. The fact that the Old Testament is the story, the narrative of God's redemptive movement, his movement to deliver and save humanity. And Jesus is the climax of that movement. He is the climax of salvation history.
Goodness, I didn't realise we were going to have to get into this. So it seems that this guy is actually trying to suggest that the Old Testament is in some way historical, and this is completely insane. Obviously, I might be misrepresenting this guy, I don't know what his full views are, but, you know, if you take the Bible literally, it's suggesting that the Earth is 6,000 years old. That's completely impossible, and it's against every measurement that we can take physically or biologically. It's also suggesting that the Hebrews, the Jewish race, spent a large amount of time in Egypt and then escaped, and that the Egyptian army was drowned in the Red Sea, of which there's no evidence whatsoever. There's never been any documented archaeological evidence that the Jews ever were in Egypt at this time. And then don't even get me started about the supposed histories about the Jewish rulers and kings. This is a mythical book, and it really doesn't seem to strengthen this man's case to bring it out in defense of the New Testament and Jesus.
The one who brings it off to fulfillment. You read the Old Testament, it's building, building, building. Jesus arrives on the scene, and he is the fulfillment. And
I am an author. This is how you write books.
The climax of God's plan of salvation for all humanity.
This whole case was sort of like one of those jigsaw puzzles where you don't know what the ultimate picture is going to be. You just put together the pieces, and as I was putting together all of the evidence, it started to take shape, and I sort of stepped back, and I could see that it was a portrait of Jesus Christ.
If you stare long enough at something, it'll become what you want it to become.
This was not just an intellectual journey. There was a very real emotional component to this, because I would find things along the way that would challenge me and my worldview on a very deep level. And I would recoil from it, and I wouldn't want to believe it. And I mean, there were so many reasons why I didn't want there to be a God, because I did not want to be held accountable for my life.
I didn't know at the time why Lee was so angry. I thought it was just being stubborn. He says, after coming through it, that it was conviction.
It seemed that the more Leslie's values were changing and her character was being transformed and the way she related to me and the children was changing, it would highlight the contrast with my life.
I was feeling fearful and angry as well that he was being affected by it in the way that he was.
I mean, the truth is, I felt like I was losing Leslie. She was being pulled away from me into this Christian subculture. I didn't fit in there. I'm the atheist. I'm the skeptic. And yet I felt like she was being pulled away, and I loved her. I didn't want to lose her. And it got to the point where I was so angry over the whole thing. One day I just reared back and I kicked a hole in our living room wall, just out of rage over the situation. It was a very ugly scene right in front of Leslie, right in front of our little girl. They were crying, and I didn't want to lose her.
It's obviously a very sad story, but it doesn't really do anything for his case that he's reached this conclusion through simply rational, investigative thought. It's clearly a very emotional journey as well, and that's absolutely fine, but I think he should certainly acknowledge, surely, the way that he felt about his wife's Christianity and the way that he felt that he was drifting apart from his wife must have played some part in the final decision that he made, even if nothing but subconsciously.
Jesus's body was never found, and so and they predicted it. Well, you know, he talked about it, and it was predicted, and it happened. I mean, it's this easy. It's as simple as that. We just tend to complicate it, man.
No,
Oh yes, us complicating things with our thinking again, oh dear.
not physically, not his physical body. So when they came the following morning and rolled back the great stone in front of the tomb, and he wasn't there, no, it must have been dark in that. I don't know. They must have missed him. No, I don't think physically a physical body can rise.
I don't think that he was yanked out of that, or physically walked out and walked down the street and met with him. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
For more than a year, I'd investigated the historical record for the reliability of the New Testament. I'd looked at the identity of Jesus. But now was time to look at the ultimate evidence for who he really was, the purported resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And for that, I went to the best scholars that I could track down.
William Lane Craig, Biola University. Gary Habermas, Liberty University. Michael Licona, North American Mission Board.
You see, while Jesus was on earth, he made some really radical claims. He claimed to be the uniquely divine servant of God, and he claimed that the only way that we could get to God would be through him. Now, I submit to you that if one of your professors made some claims like that, you would think that he or she was a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. Those are some really audacious claims. Well, a lot of Jesus critics responded to him the same way that you or I would respond to someone making those claims today. Oh yeah, pal? You really think that's who you are? Well, tell you what, why don't you show it to us? Why don't you give us a sign? Show us a miracle or something. And Jesus said, well, I'll give you one miracle, one sign, my resurrection from the dead.
The resurrection of Jesus really is the pivotal event of history. Anybody can claim to be the Son of God, as Jesus clearly did.
I'm not convinced. He doesn't actually claim that he's the Son of God in Mark. And also, to be honest, we don't know what he claimed about because we don't know exactly what he said, because what we've got in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are Chinese whispers of Chinese whispers that have been copied and accidentally changed and purposefully changed over hundreds of years. So I don't think we can really draw that conclusion, Lee.
The question is, can you back it up? What evidence is there to support your claim? What credentials do you have? And if Jesus really did return from the dead, that's excellent evidence that he is who he claimed to be, the one and only Son of God.
To weigh the validity of Jesus' resurrection, we must first consider his death. Many skeptics have proposed that Jesus merely fainted on the cross, or was drugged, and later escaped as part of a conspiracy. By contrast, the four gospel narratives collectively describe the events of his public beating, death by crucifixion, and burial.
Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15.
Chances of surviving crucifixion were extremely bleak. Crucifixion and the tortures that normally preceded it was the worst way to die in antiquity. A person was scourged to the point usually that their intestines, arteries, and veins were laid bare. And then after that, a person was dragged out where they were impaled to a cross or a tree and then left hanging there in excruciating pain. In fact, the word excruciating comes from the Latin, out of the cross.
Jesus was being tried and executed as a rebel leader. Now, in the Roman army, if you were responsible for looking after one prisoner of war, even if he was a rather insignificant prisoner of war, if you let him get away, your life would be forfeit in place of his, and life was very cheap. If you were looking after the execution of a rebel leader and you let him get away, you're in deep trouble. You're not going back home to your wife and kids. No way, game over. The Romans were very, very good at killing people. They specialized in it. They prided themselves on it.
Perhaps the most definitive statement of Jesus' death at the hands of the Romans is recorded in the Gospel of John.
One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John 19:34.
Yeah, I 100% agree that he's dead. Let's move on to the exciting bit. Come on, guys, let's get through to the bit about where his body's gone, because I'd love to see what ideas you've got on that.
Medical experts have concluded that this account from John, an eyewitness of the crucifixion, is evidence that as he suffocated on the cross, Jesus' heart had ruptured.
There came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. Matthew 27.
Do you think the Romans would have really let this happen?
All four Gospels tell us that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. That's a remarkable statement, and certainly a historical statement. The evidence for that is, first of all, Joseph of Arimathea is identified as a member of the council, the Sanhedrin, that condemned Jesus.
The presence of Joseph of Arimathea in the empty tomb narrative indicates that this is a historically reliable account of what really happened.
What, because Joseph of Arimathea is another person who's named in the Bible? So we're saying that it's likely that both Gandalf and Frodo both existed because they're both mentioned in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
His name would have been known to people in those days very much like a United States senator would be known today. It would have been very clear where his tomb was, so that there would have been no question about the location of Jesus' burial. It also, I think, indicates that the burial account of Jesus could not have been made up.
It is highly unusual to find that the person who alone has the courage to go to Pilate and give Jesus an honorable burial is not members of his family, faithful disciples who followed him to the end. Instead, it is a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very high court, all of whom, Mark says, had condemned Jesus of Nazareth to the cross. The fact that it is Joseph of Arimathea who is the person responsible for giving Jesus an honorable burial is an awkward and embarrassing fact for the early church, and yet this tradition is faithfully preserved in almost all of the traditions that we have about the burial of Jesus.
If Jesus really was killed by the Romans, if his body really was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, then the next focus of my investigation became obvious. On the first Sunday after the crucifixion, was the tomb of Jesus Christ really empty?
On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. Luke 24:1.
The empty tomb story also has a very embarrassing feature of it that is preserved in the memory of the early church, namely the discovery of the empty tomb by women.
Yes, but how many women? Who was present at the tomb? Was it one woman, like in John? Was it two, like in Matthew? Was it three, like in Mark? Or was it many, like in Luke? What did they see when they went there? Did they see one person, that's Matthew and Mark, or did they see two people, Luke and John? They cannot both be right. And what did they go on and do? Did they tell no one, like the original of Mark shows? These are not consistent accounts.
Now, in order to appreciate this, you have to understand something of the status of women in Palestinian Jewish society. In that society, which was a patriarchal society, women were frankly second-class citizens.
If you were going to invent an account about an empty tomb, then why on earth would you invent witnesses, primary witnesses, whom no one would believe? In fact, they would scoff at that later on.
Supposing you were inventing the story of the resurrection of Jesus, many people have said, oh, this was all just dreamed up later on. Well, how would you have done that? The one thing you wouldn't have done would have been to have not only a woman, but a woman who's got nobody quite knows what, but a fairly shady past, as your prime witness. And yet there she is, Mary Magdalene, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and particularly in John. And already by the middle of the 2nd century, the pagans are sneering, this is just based on the testimony of hysterical women, you can't believe that. But the early Christians stuck to their story, they stuck to their guns, they stuck to the women. They said this is how it was. Now, they just would never have made that up, and that actually has enormous ramifications. If this is how the story was, and they didn't change it to airbrush Mary out, then this really must have been what happened on that first Easter day.
I think that's pretty tenuous. I mean, if you were trying to make something convincing, one of the first things that you'd consider doing is putting in somewhat embarrassing facts, because it would make it look more convincing in exactly the way that they're arguing for now. So it's also quite possible that these were added to make, but by early Christians in their verbal oral traditions regarding this as ways of making it sound more believable. I don't think that it proves that Jesus rose from the dead or that the tomb was empty.
The chief priests devised a plan. They gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." Matthew 28:12 and 13.
Matthew reports that the Jewish authorities were claiming that the disciples of Jesus had stolen his corpse. And this is verified by Justin and Tertullian a little bit later on, saying that the Jewish leaders were still saying the same thing in their day. Now here's the question. If the body is still in the tomb, why are you saying that the disciples had stolen it?
Well, if you think about that, the claim that the body was stolen confirms that Jesus' enemies acknowledged that the tomb was empty. If you've got a stolen body, you must have an empty tomb.
Now, it's a circuitous argument because it works on the basis that you believe that what's written in the Bible is true.
If the tomb was not empty, Jesus' opponents would surely have gone and got the body and shown it as soon as the disciples began proclaiming the resurrection.
I found the evidence for the empty tomb very convincing, but you know what? That didn't tell me what happened to Jesus. Is it true that hundreds of people really saw him alive after the crucifixion? My research took me to a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and it contains the earliest passage of all about what happened to the resurrected Jesus.
Whoa, sorry, I should have paused this earlier. He seems to have stopped talking about the empty tomb a lot earlier than I was expecting. I thought this was going to take up a lot more of the film. It might be that there's more coming on later, so I'm a bit late on my great denouement. What I was going to say as I was listening to that, and this is something that I'd have often, exactly what I've just heard there is exactly the arguments that I would have given in defence of Christianity when I was a Christian as well, about trying to say, well, what happened to his body? Where did his body go? Well, the first thing that I need to say is that actually any explanation that we know can occur on Earth is far more likely than the empty tomb being explained by someone coming back from the dead, because we've got no evidence that that has ever happened apart from in the Bible. Okay, so you could actually say, oh, I think he spontaneously combusted, and that would still be more likely than he rose from the dead. Now, I don't think he spontaneously combusted. I think that's ridiculous. I also agree that it would probably be quite difficult for someone to have stolen his body and hidden it. But the truth is, if you want to know what most likely happened to Jesus' body, it's that he was probably taken off the cross and thrown into a gutter like every other criminal would have been, and his body wasn't present because it was eaten by dogs. I know that sounds like an absolutely horrible thing to say, and I'm not trying to be rude or unpleasant, but I'm just being honest. That's what the Romans would have done with a criminal's body, and that is still the most likely thing that happened to Jesus' body. The only evidence we've got to the contrary of that is the Bible, which, as we've mentioned before, it cannot be viewed as an accurate historical source.
He was raised on the third day. He appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me. 1 Corinthians 15, 4-8.
Paul, who is a first-generation Christian, having met and seen the resurrected Jesus, describes resurrection appearances to Peter, to the apostles, to James, and finally to himself. And he also mentions 500 people who saw Jesus alive. So we have eyewitness first-hand account of someone who himself saw Jesus alive and knows of 500 people or so who saw Jesus alive. That's extraordinarily strong evidence.
I'm sorry, we've been there before, and it just isn't extraordinarily strong evidence. It's certainly not strong enough evidence to claim supernatural events.
These people, Paul tells us, were still alive at the time that he was telling the Corinthians about it. And his implication is we have hundreds of people who actually saw Jesus risen from the dead. If you don't believe me, you can ask them about it because they're still alive.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells the Corinthian church that he passed on what he received. He uses the language, actually, of a formal transfer of tradition. What he received, and then he describes the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection appearances. This confirms for us that the accounts of the resurrection were creedal tradition that were passed on to Paul. So if 1 Corinthians was written in the early to mid-50s of the first century, these traditions were much earlier than that, going back to the period of Paul's conversion in the 30s. So that pushes the accounts of the resurrection to a very, very early date.
Paul seems to think that the best argument for this text is that he received it from trustworthy persons. I gave you what I was given. The answer's right. I went to the right people. And critics believe that Paul got this material. Generally, they say he received it in Jerusalem about 35 AD.
First of all, he's early. He's writing within 20 to 35 years of the purported event itself, because he's quoting from a creed, an oral formula, tradition that predates the writing of the New Testament, for which most scholars date to between 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion itself.
1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 provides evidence that belief in the resurrection was already present among Jews within 2 to 3 years after Jesus was killed. That means that the resurrection stories aren't something that evolved over 30, 40, 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus.
But the point is, as they're saying there, we don't have these early creeds. We've got some evidence of what they might have said because of what Paul says, but we don't actually have the original creeds. And what we have got is we've got significant discrepancies between Paul and the Gospels. We've got discrepancies between the Gospels themselves. And we've also got a large number of Paul's letters which are widely considered to be forgeries. I, again, do not think that this stands up as an example of biblical inerrancy. But, you know, even if you're not someone who believes that the Bible is the infallible word of God and can accept that it was written by people and they got things wrong, this is not high-quality evidence that any of this really happened.
So we have the empty tomb, we have the eyewitnesses, we have the early accounts. The question is, are there any other additional facts, circumstantial evidence, to support the resurrection?
While the Apostle Paul described hundreds of eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus, the full impact of the event is perhaps best measured by the subsequent growth of the early Christian church in the face of intense persecution. In the 2nd century, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote, "Nero inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome."
Even the most critical, skeptical scholars recognize that the earliest disciples at least believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. In fact, they pinned nearly everything on it. Without belief in Jesus' resurrection, the early Christian movement could never have come into being.
They recognized in Jesus something special, but they wondered if they were mistaken when he died. They didn't anticipate that. Suffer maybe, but die at the hands of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor? In fact, even when the first reports of his resurrection reached their ears, they were still doubtful and skeptical. But when they met the risen Lord, their skepticism was transformed into a very confident faith, a great joy, and a determination to preach the good news to everyone else. And I think that's the part that's awfully hard to refute, because we have this turnabout, this transformation of a discouraged and bewildered following on the basis of the good news.
I don't think you can be certain that the disciples actually did necessarily come to the belief that Jesus rose from the dead, but I agree that the vast majority of scholars do think that's the case, and let's just assume that that is the case and that the early disciples did think that Jesus had risen from the dead. That doesn't mean that he actually did rise from the dead necessarily. There's lots of other explanations for how that could happen. Isn't it just more likely that this was a combination of wishful thinking and pre-scientific superstition? Further evidence by the fact that there's significant discrepancies and differences between the appearances of Jesus after his death throughout the Gospels, the most major one being the fact that Jesus doesn't appear to anyone after his death, apart from some women who don't tell anyone at the end of Mark.
Somehow you have to explain the explosion from scared followers who run away to let's worship him, let's sing to him, let's pray to him.
If there was no resurrection, and more to the point, if there was no resurrection appearances of Jesus, to those who doubted and were discouraged and denied and betrayed Jesus, we would not be sitting here talking about this today.
All right, so is the Quran correct as well then? Because the reasoning that you've used there presupposes that should a religion have staying power, that it's therefore true. So Judaism's true, Islam's true, Christianity's true, Hinduism's true. I don't think that guy there thinks that those are all true, and I don't think there'd be very many people out there who genuinely believe that those are all true to the word of absolute, this is the truth. That is a ridiculous argument.
Other messianic figures had risen in the past, had claimed to be somebody, and had been suppressed and killed by the Romans. Yet no movement arose around those dead messiahs. But these disciples of Jesus were willing to go to the ends of the earth proclaiming the gospel message, were willing to suffer and die for that. The transformation from a bunch of defeated cowards to boldly, fearlessly proclaiming the gospel, even to the point of death, to me confirms that something happened on that first Easter morning.
I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 2 Corinthians 11:23.
After Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples lived lives of hardship for 20, 30, 40 years, suffered greatly in their ministries, and eventually suffered martyrdom and execution without recanting for their belief that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead.
I mean, what were they gaining? Were they becoming rich? They're running around the countryside. They're, in some cases, abandoning their family for periods of time so they can preach. What they got for their efforts is death, in many cases.
You also have to remember that the disciples died not just for something they believed was true. They died for something they actually saw with their own eyes. It's much more difficult to explain that away than it is for someone who dies for a belief and they're sincerely wrong.
Again, this cannot be used as a valid argument for the truth of Christianity, because it's also true about other major world religions as well, and I'm sure that these speakers here would not believe that those religions are true for the same reason. So you can't use an argument like this for one religion, but at the same time say that it's not a valid argument when used for other religions. People can believe things so strongly that they'll die for them. That doesn't necessarily mean that those things are true.
I came across a bit of evidence I really found fascinating. James was a half-brother of Jesus, and he was not a believer in Jesus during Jesus' lifetime, but he later died the death of a martyr as a leader of the local church. In a similar way, Saul of Tarsus was a persecutor of Christians, and yet he later becomes the Apostle Paul, this incredible missionary. So I had to ask myself, what led to this radical transformation of these skeptics?
Sometimes people will come to believe something they wish to be true. If you believe hard enough that a person is loving and kind, you can talk yourself into believing that, even though the person is not loving and kind. It's very, very difficult, however, to explain people coming to believe something that they're actually standing against. Now, in the case of James and Paul, they did not believe in Jesus before his crucifixion. In fact, they thought he was deranged, and they did not accept what he said and what he taught.
James, the brother of Jesus, is a skeptic who doesn't come to Jesus until he meets the risen Lord. Critics allow that. Paul's a persecutor till he meets the risen Jesus. That's not the kind of testimony of someone who all gets together and say, hey, let's just cook this thing up.
One of the certainties, it seems to me, related to the testimony of the apostles is that they truly believed that Jesus was who he claimed he was, and they truly believed that he had risen from the dead, because they were willing to die for that. Very few people are willing to die for something they don't really believe in, or something even worse that they know to be a lie.
When Jesus was executed, his disciples were rightly afraid. They scattered. They were fearful for their own life. Their hopes had been dashed because they had believed Jesus was the promised one who was going to usher a new day in for Israel. Turned out he wasn't, because he was murdered by crucifixion under the authority of the Roman Empire. And yet, shortly thereafter, we find them taking a stand in Jerusalem, proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah, the very Son of God. How do we explain that? How do we explain the fact that they were even willing to propagate this the rest of their lives and go to martyrs' deaths for their belief? The only rational explanation is that something happened to them between the death of Jesus and 3 days later, and according to their own words, it was that they saw Jesus risen from the dead for themselves.
People have often said, and I think it's a perfectly fair position, that okay, there aren't actually any good alternative hypotheses for how you explain the rise of early Christianity, but because we know as an absolute fact which we're not prepared to let go of, that nobody ever rises from the dead, then there must in fact be some other alternative hypothesis. And I want to say, okay, if you want to make the absoluteness of bodily death the cornerstone of your entire worldview, I actually can't stop you. If you choose to say, no, here I stand, death is the end, and nobody ever comes back from it, and that's just the way it is, well, that's where a lot of people were in the ancient world, it's where a lot of people are in the modern world. I think that that worldview is radically challenged by the strong evidence which points to the resurrection of Jesus, but it's up to somebody what they do with that challenge.
At last someone said it, which is brilliant, and I fully, absolutely respect what he's saying there, which is, to my mind, and I hope that people listening don't disagree with this, that essentially he's saying that to believe this, you do have to have a degree of faith, okay? And this is why I'm concerned about the general tone of this film so far, which has been, in a way, sort of suggesting that you'd be mad not to believe this, and that there's loads and loads of evidence. In fact, there is very, very shaky evidence for any of this, and certainly there is not enough evidence for any rational person to come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and that he was raised from the dead, and that he died to save us from our sins, and that if we don't believe in him, then we'll have a lifetime, well, no, more than a lifetime, an eternity of eternal torment for not accepting him. That being said, it's perfectly reasonable to have faith that such a thing takes place, that has taken place in the past, but it is a fallacy to say that that faith is based on strong evidence. And the danger of faiths like this is they can lead you to do unusual and sometimes quite unpleasant things, and they can also lead you to believe some quite dangerous things as well. There might be people out there who go, oh, it can't really be, but the faith gives people meaning and things like that. But just think of it in a different way. Just imagine that someone was saying that they had faith that they had a giant diamond in the backyard that was buried there, and if they ever found it, it was going to bring them, great riches. And you'd be trying to argue with them, saying, that's not possible. And they'd be going, well, but do you know how much meaning it gives me that there is a diamond in my back garden, and I spend every Sunday digging for it, trying to find this diamond? Or the words of the bishop there, where I think he was pretty much saying, my life would have no meaning if there was not a diamond in the backyard. Or I wouldn't want to live in a world in which there wasn't a diamond buried in my back. Now, if someone was saying that, they'd be completely insane, wouldn't they? But it requires the same amount of faith to believe that as it does to believe the resurrection story of Jesus. like the opening of Spooks or something. Da-dun, da-da, MI5, not 9 to 5.
The evidence accumulated over time until November the 8th of 1981, which is sort of when I reached a critical mass. I remember going alone in my room, and I took a yellow legal pad and put a line down the middle, and on one side I started to list all of the evidence I had encountered for Jesus Christ being the Son of God, and on the other side all the negative evidence against that. And I wrote and I wrote page after page, and finally I put my pen down and I said, wait a minute. In light of this avalanche of evidence pointing toward the truth of Christianity, it would require more faith for me to maintain my atheism than to become a follower of Jesus Christ.
Isn't it just really weird that it just so happened that this true religion that you found just happened to be Christianity, like the predominant religion of the country that he lives in, rather than, say, being Hinduism or Islam? Had he been born in a different part of the world, do you think that bit of paper that you put on would have not had pretty much the same points on it, but regarding a completely different religion? At the end of the day, this is based entirely on the situation you're in as a person and the world that you're living in at the time. How on earth can a God judge you on the basis of whether or not you accept or do not accept him, when a huge amount of that decision is based on circumstances of where you live and who your family are? That seems remarkably unfair, and it also points to the Bible not being true.
And so that's the moment that I decided, consistent with the evidence, the most logical, the most rational step I could take was a step of faith in the same direction the evidence was pointing, and put my trust in Jesus. And after I did that, I thought, maybe Leslie would like to hear about this.
I thought it was too good to be true. My heart was pounding. I was in tears. I was so excited. I just threw my arms around him and kissed him and hugged him and told him how I'd been praying and how lots of people had been praying that this day would come.
She threw her arms around me and she said, "You hard-hearted son of a Baptist," she said, "I've been telling you this for 2 years. I mean, come on." And that began a transformational process for me, where over time my philosophy and my attitudes, relationships, parenting, worldview, all of that began to change over time for good.
Okay, so we're now hearing that wonderful, beautiful fallacy that we often hear, that somehow Christianity has this monopoly over good, as if there aren't any good people who aren't Christians. If you need to believe in an eternal overlord who sends you to hell if you don't believe in him to be good, then what on earth does that say about you morally? That you will not be good unless someone tells you that you have to, with the threat of eternal torture?
Really for good.
When Lee became a Christian, his whole life started to change, to the extent that our 5-year-old daughter, who also saw those changes, went to her Sunday school teacher and told her that she wanted Jesus to do in her life what he had done in her daddy's life.
Well, now that is a precocious 5-year-old. I mean, my 5-year-old is more interested in talking about My Little Pony, doing ballet, and talking about how you can become a princess. I'm not convinced that story is any more true than what's written in the Bible.
Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And that's my story. It was someone who said, I'm going to investigate this stuff with an open mind, let it take me wherever the evidence will take me. And what I discovered in the end is Jesus made the claim that he is the truth, that everything hinges on his identity. In fact, everything hinges on the resurrection, because anybody can claim to be the Son of God. If Jesus really did return from the dead, then he is who he claimed to be, and that changes everything. But what about your own journey? I'd really encourage you, if you've never done it, to investigate the evidence for yourself, but make 3 resolutions up front. Number 1, make it a front burner issue in your life. Number 2, resolve to have an open mind, to go wherever the evidence takes you, even if it takes you to the very uncomfortable conclusion that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And then finally, resolve that once the evidence is in, you will reach a verdict in the case for Christ.
Yay, I think me and Lee are going to agree on something there, which is 100% I do think that anyone listening to this should look into this, unless they've very, very significantly done that in depth before and feel that there's nothing new that they've learned either from Lee or from me on this matter, because there's far more learned people out there than Lee, and there's many, 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 many more people out there who are qualified to speak on this than me. I would particularly encourage you to read the works of Bart Ehrman, who is an excellent biblical scholar of a different type to those that are presented here, and I'd compare and contrast it to what these biblical scholars here have said. I'd also suggest that you read the Bible. In particular, I'd suggest that you read the four Gospels, but I'd suggest that you read them side by side, because by doing that, you'll see that there are significant differences and inconsistencies between them. And this is actually of great interest and can tell us quite a lot about perhaps what different parts of the early church believed about Jesus early on. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed watching the film. As you can see there, that I haven't been convinced by the case for Christ. I've certainly enjoyed watching this, and I've certainly enjoyed seeing that much of what was being said there was exactly what I did used to believe when I was a Christian. If you're in that situation of having watched that and being maybe a Christian who's now starting to doubt this in some way, I just encourage you to do a bit more reading. Read some works by Bart Ehrman in particular, but also, study the Gospels side by side and see for yourself that there are significant inconsistencies there. And at the end of the day, I don't mind what conclusion you come to. I just think that it's important that you think about it. And I am sad that there are plenty of people out there, both default atheists and default religious people, who've never really thought their beliefs through. And I think that that is a great sadness. So anyway, once again, I hope you enjoyed it. And any questions or comments, please post them on YouTube or go to my blog, leavingchristianityblog.wordpress.